Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to take a deep dive into one of the most important topics in hematology, the management of sickle cell anemia crisis. We'll cover this with a clinical approach, focusing on triage, updated management, and a look at the exciting emerging therapies. As always, please remember that this content is for medical education only and is not intended as medical advice for patient care. Before we begin, a quick but important disclaimer. This lecture is designed solely for educational and teaching purposes to supplement your medical training. It is not a substitute for your clinical judgment, direct patient care, or professional medical advice. When you are managing patients, you must always consult your current clinical guidelines, your institution's protocols, and of course, the guidance of your attending physicians. Alright, let's start with a case to get us thinking. You're in the emergency department, and you meet a 24-year-old male with a known history of homozygous sickle cell disease. He presents with severe bilateral leg and lower back pain that started about 6 hours ago. He rates his pain a 9 out of 10 and tells you it feels like his usual crisis, but significantly worse. He's already tried ibuprofen and hydrating at home, but nothing has touched the pain. His vitals show a temperature of 38.4 degrees Celsius. A heart rate of 112, blood pressure of 118/72, a respiratory rate of 22, and his oxygen saturation is 94% on room air. On exam, he is clearly in significant distress, he's diaphoretic, and you note mild scleral icterus. So, looking at this patient, what are your immediate priorities? What are the first things that come to mind that you need to address right now? By the end of this lecture, you should be able to do 5 key things. First, to recognize and effectively triage the different presentations of a sickle cell crisis. Second, to apply a systematic approach to the initial workup and management. Third, and critically, to identify and manage life-threatening emergencies like acute chest syndrome. Fourth, we will review the current landscape of disease-modifying therapies, including some important recent updates. And finally, we'll touch on the exciting and rapidly emerging field of gene therapy for sickle cell disease. So, what exactly is sickle cell disease? It's a group of inherited red blood cell disorders that result in chronic hemolytic anemia and, as we know, recurrent acute crises. The term sickle cell crisis is often used interchangeably with pain, but it's crucial to remember that this term actually encompasses a wide range of acute conditions, not just the painful episodes. As you can see here, we have the classic vaso-occlusive or painful crisis, which is the most common. But we also have a plastic crisis, often triggered by parvovirus B19, splenic sequestration, characterized by rapid splenic enlargement, and others like hyperhemolytic and hepatic crises. And of course, acute chest syndrome, which is the leading cause of death in these patients. On the right, you see a list of other serious acute complications that can arise, from infections like pneumonia and meningitis to stroke and venous thromboembolism. We must keep this broad differential in mind. Let's quickly review the basic pathophysiology. It all starts with a single point mutation in the beta-globin gene, where glutamic acid is replaced by valine. This change leads to the production of hemoglobin S. When deoxygenated, hemoglobin S polymerizes, forming long, rigid polymers that distort the red blood cell into that classic sickle shape. These sickled cells are not flexible. They get stuck in the microvasculature, causing vaso-occlusion, which leads to ischemia, intense pain, and progressive organ damage. Furthermore, these cells have a much shorter lifespan, about 17 days compared to the normal 120, leading to chronic hemolysis and anemia. So what triggers these crises? The most common precipitant is infection, but dehydration, cold exposure, hypoxia, and both physical and emotional stress are also well-known triggers. Let's break down the main types of sickle cell crisis. First, the vaso-occlusive crisis. This is the hallmark of the disease and by far the most common presentation, caused by microvascular occlusion leading to severe pain. Next is acute chest syndrome. This is defined by a new infiltrate on chest X-ray plus respiratory symptoms, and it is the leading cause of death in adult patients. Third, aplastic crisis, which is a transient failure of erythropoiesis, most often caused by a parvovirus B19 infection. This leads to a sudden, severe anemia as the respiratory count plummets. And fourth, splenic sequestration, where there is a rapid pooling of blood in the spleen. This causes a precipitous drop in hemoglobin and can quickly lead to hypovolemic shock, especially in children. When a patient with sickle cell disease presents to the emergency department, your first job is triage. You have to quickly determine who is sick. This assessment needs to happen within 30 minutes of arrival. On the left, you see the critical red flags: a fever over 38.5, an oxygen saturation less than 95%, any chest pain or respiratory distress, any acute neurologic changes suggesting a stroke, an acute abdomen, priapism, or a significant hemoglobin drop. These are all signs that demand immediate, escalated attention. On the right is your initial assessment checklist. You run through your airway, breathing, and circulation, assess their pain, and ask key questions. Is this their usual crisis pattern? Are there any new symptoms? Knowing their baseline hemoglobin and current medications is vital. This rapid, structured assessment is key to catching life-threatening complications early. Once you've triaged the patient, you'll move to your initial workup. On the laboratory side, you'll get a complete blood count with differential and a respiratory count, a complete metabolic panel to check renal and liver function, and markers of hemolysis like lactate dehydrogenase and haptoglobin. A type and screen is essential in case a transfusion is needed. If the patient is febrile, you'll draw blood cultures. On the imaging front, a chest X-ray is critical for any patient with chest pain, fever, or hypoxia to rule out acute chest syndrome. If you have any concern for a pulmonary embolism, remember these patients are hypercoagulable, so a computed tomography angiogram may be warranted. And of course, any neurologic changes mandate an emergent computed tomography or magnetic resonance imaging of the brain to rule out a stroke. Now, let's talk about pain management, which is the absolute core of treating a vaso-occlusive crisis. The guiding principle is to initiate analgesia within 30 minutes of triage. And remember, the gold standard for assessing pain is the patient's own report. There is no lab test or physical finding that can tell you how much pain they are in. Believe your patient. Our approach follows 4 steps. First, establish intravenous access and start fluids. Hydration is key to reducing plasma osmolality and sickling. If the patient is hypovolemic, lactated ringers is preferred over normal saline. If they are euvolemic, we use hypotonic maintenance fluids, specifically 0.45% sodium chloride, with or without D5. We actively avoid normal saline for maintenance, as it can lead to hypernatremia and worsen sickling. And always monitor closely to avoid fluid overload. Second, opioid analgesia. Intravenous morphine or hydromorphone are the mainstays. Reassess pain every 15 to 30 minutes. For admitted patients, a patient-controlled analgesia is preferred. And a critical point, never use meperidine. It has a toxic metabolite that lowers the seizure threshold and is contraindicated. Third, adjunctive analgesia. A short course of intravenous ketorolac can be very helpful, but monitor renal function. Scheduled acetaminophen is also useful. For refractory pain, consider a subanesthetic ketamine infusion. And another important negative, do not use ice or cold compresses, as cold can precipitate more sickling. Finally, supportive measures. Incentive spirometry every 2 hours while awake is absolutely critical to prevent acute chest syndrome. Warm compresses can provide comfort. Supplemental oxygen should only be used if the oxygen saturation is less than 95%. And all admitted adults should receive deep vein thrombosis prophylaxis. Let's focus on acute chest syndrome, because it is the single leading cause of death in adult patients with sickle cell disease. The clinical definition is a new pulmonary infiltrate on chest X-ray involving at least one complete lung segment, plus at least one of the following: a fever, chest pain, respiratory symptoms like cough or tachypnea, or hypoxia. The etiology is multifactorial. In adults, it's often triggered by a pain crisis leading to fat embolism from bone marrow necrosis. Infection is a more common trigger in children. And a key clinical pearl. Acute chest syndrome often develops 2 to 3 days after a patient is admitted for a pain crisis. You must maintain a high index of suspicion. Management of acute chest syndrome follows an evidence-based, multi-pronged approach. First, supplemental oxygen to maintain saturation at or above 95%. Second, empiric antibiotics. A third-generation cephalosporin plus a macrolide is a standard combination to cover atypical organisms. A fourth-generation fluoroquinolone is another option. If the patient is severely ill, you should add vancomycin. Third, transfusion therapy. For mild to moderate cases, a simple transfusion with a goal hemoglobin of 10 is appropriate. For severe or rapidly progressing disease, you must move to an exchange transfusion with a goal of getting the hemoglobin S level below 30%. Fourth, incentive spirometry every 1 to 2 hours is non-negotiable. Fifth, aggressive pain control is needed, but you must avoid oversedation, which can worsen hypoventilation. And finally, careful fluid management to maintain euvolemia and avoid overload. Now, for a very important update. The 2025 TASC trial provided new evidence for using therapeutic dose anticoagulation, like tinzaparin, in adults with acute chest syndrome. The trial showed it led to faster resolution and reduced opioid use. This should be considered in high-risk patients who do not have a high risk of bleeding. You would want to avoid it in patients with a high bleeding risk or those also on nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Beyond acute chest syndrome, there are several other acute complications you must know. Stroke is a devastating complication. Suspect it with any focal neurologic deficit, seizure, or altered mental status. The immediate response is an emergent computed tomography of the head and an exchange transfusion to get the hemoglobin S below 30%. Splenic sequestration involves an acute drop in hemoglobin as the spleen rapidly enlarges. It can cause shock and requires aggressive fluid resuscitation and transfusion. Aplastic crisis, from parvovirus, presents with a near-zero respiratory count and requires transfusion if the anemia is symptomatic. And finally, priapism. An erection lasting longer than 4 hours is a urologic emergency requiring intravenous hydration, analgesia, and a urology consult for potential aspiration. Let's clarify the 2 main types of transfusion therapy. Simple transfusion is used for symptomatic anemia, aplastic crisis, splenic sequestration, and mild to moderate acute chest syndrome. The goal is to raise the hemoglobin to around 10, but it is critical not to exceed 11 to avoid hyperviscosity. Exchange transfusion, on the other hand, is reserved for the most severe complications: acute stroke, severe acute chest syndrome, multi-organ failure, and refractory priapism. Here, the goal is different. We are actively removing the patient's sickled cells to lower the hemoglobin S percentage to below 30%, while keeping the total hemoglobin at or below 10. And a crucial safety note for all transfusions in these patients: always use look-reduced, phenotypically matched, and hemoglobin S-negative blood products to minimize complications. Now let's review the disease-modifying therapies. And before we dive into the specific agents, it's essential to remember that all patients with sickle cell disease should be on daily folic acid supplementation to support the high red blood cell turnover from chronic hemolysis. With that foundational support in place, we can discuss the drugs that modify the disease course itself. Hydroxyurea remains the first-line therapy and the standard of care. It works by increasing fetal hemoglobin, which interferes with hemoglobin S polymerization, and it is proven to reduce pain crises, acute chest syndrome, and mortality. L-glutamine, or Endari, is an add-on therapy that reduces oxidative stress and has been shown to reduce the frequency of pain crises. Crizanlizumab, or Adakveo, is a P-selectin inhibitor that reduces cell adhesion. It is still FDA-approved, but its authorization was revoked in Europe in 2023, so it is currently under scrutiny. And finally, a major update regarding Voxelotor or Oxbryta. This drug was voluntarily withdrawn worldwide by the manufacturer in September 2024 after post-marketing data showed an increase in vaso-occlusive events and fatal outcomes. It is critical that you do not prescribe this medication. And that brings us to the most exciting development in sickle cell disease in decades: the gene therapy era. In December of 2023, the FDA approved two groundbreaking therapies. On the left, we have Casgevy, which uses CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing to reactivate the production of fetal hemoglobin. The results have been remarkable, with nearly all patients in the trial remaining free from severe pain crises. On the right is Lyfgenia, which uses a lentiviral vector to add a modified, anti-sickling beta-globin gene. It has also shown a greater than 90% reduction in pain crises, but it does carry a black box warning for a risk of hematologic malignancy. The major caveats for both are the significant toxicity from the required myeloablative chemotherapy and the astronomical cost, which severely limits access for now. But this is truly a historic milestone. So, to summarize the key updates. First, the Voxelotor withdrawal in September 2024 is a major change in our pharmacologic options. Second, haploidentical stem cell transplant is emerging as a more accessible curative option compared to gene therapy, with a lower cost and a much wider donor pool. And finally, keep an eye on the pipeline. Pyruvate kinase activators are in late-stage trials and aim to improve red blood cell metabolism. This is a rapidly evolving field. Alright, let's test our knowledge with a board-style question. A 22-year-old woman with homozygous sickle cell disease presents with a high fever, cough, pleuritic chest pain, and an oxygen saturation of 90%. Her chest X-ray shows a new left lower lobe infiltrate, and her hemoglobin has dropped to 6.2 from a baseline of 8.0. Which of the following is the most appropriate next step? Is it A, B, C, or D? The correct answer is C. This patient has all the features of severe acute chest syndrome: hypoxia, a new infiltrate, and a significant drop in hemoglobin. This requires the most aggressive therapy, which includes an exchange transfusion, broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics, and supplemental oxygen. So, let's summarize with the key takeaways from today. Number 1. Treat pain aggressively and early. Your patient's report is the gold standard. Number 2. Always think of acute chest syndrome. Any vaso-occlusive crisis patient who develops a fever, chest pain, or hypoxia has acute chest syndrome until proven otherwise. And remember that incentive spirometry is your best tool for prevention. Number 3. Know your red flags. Fever, hypoxia, neurologic changes, or an acute drop in hemoglobin demand immediate escalation. Number 4. Be smart about your fluids. Use hypotonic fluids like 0.45% sodium chloride with or without D5 for maintenance, and avoid normal saline boluses in euvolemic patients. Number 5. Hydroxyurea is the backbone of medical therapy. Voxelotor is withdrawn. And number 6. Exchange transfusion is the intervention of choice for stroke, severe acute chest syndrome, and multi-organ failure, with a target hemoglobin S of less than 30%. As we conclude, I want to emphasize that this lecture is a simplified overview. For comprehensive clinical guidance, you must always refer to primary sources like UpToDate, the American Society of Hematology guidelines, and of course, your own institutional protocols. Do your own reading, do your own analysis, and always stay curious and keep learning. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions. And I want to leave you with this final thought, which is perhaps the most important takeaway of all. The best thing you can do for a sickle cell patient in crisis is to believe their pain.